Hello, I am Surgeon General, and in this video I will be showcasing new tech from Settlers League that enables pretty substantial increased maximum rage and rage regeneration for a relatively low opportunity cost. I have implemented this tech on my current character, which is stacking rage, in order to benefit from its more damage multiplier. Rage was modified in patch 3.25 to make it more accessible to attack-based characters on the bottom and the left of the skill tree. It now grants 1% more attack damage per stack. Rage has a maximum stack size of 30, but this maximum can be increased by picking up sources of increased maximum rage on the bottom left of the passive tree or on unique equipment. Since the more attack damage from rage works multiplicatively with other more multipliers such as those on support gems, it is now an important part of scaling DPS on endgame attack builds. Settlers League also introduced new retaliation skills. These skills are locked by default, but become usable when certain conditions are met. In return for this inconsistent usability, the retaliation skills are very powerful, having either very large base damage and added damage effectiveness or granting powerful buffs. Vengeful Cry, a buffing warcry, will be the subject of this video. Vengeful Cry does not exert attacks, but instead grants a powerful buff with two effects. First, it grants rage regeneration and prevents the inherent decay of rage. This can be very useful by itself for characters on the top and right side of the skill tree who would otherwise have a hard time finding a source of rage on hit. Note that this part of the buff requires and scales with warcry power. The amount of rage generated per second scales with the number and type of nearby enemies. If you want to guarantee maximum rage generation without caring about nearby enemies, you will need a source of warcries have infinite power, available on either the Red Blade Banner Shield or the new Chieftain Ascendancy node. However, even better than the rage generation, the Vengeful Cry buff also grants an additional 25 max rage, by itself raising the rage limit to 55. The increase to the rage limit is always 25, regardless of the power counted by the warcry. There is no strict need for Red Blade Banner. Furthermore, both the maximum rage and rage regeneration can be scaled with warcry buff effect, which act as linear multipliers to the above effects. Together, these buffs can amp up the more damage multiplier on rage and let characters easily reach the rage cap. To demonstrate the power of this skill, this chart shows the more damage multiplier from rage. The green line shows a comparison against characters that are already using the base 30 rage, and the red dashed line shows how much more damage you would get on a character that doesn't already use rage at all. Since both parts of the Vengeful Cry buff scale with warcry buff effect, I've shown these multipliers as functions of the amount of increased buff effect on the character. For reference, there's just under 100% increased warcry buff effect available on the skill tree, another 30% on the Chieftain Ascendancy, and then a smattering available on some unique equipment and explicit equipment mods. Some investment into warcries can boost the effectiveness of more damage from rage to over 80%. This is more than twice the effectiveness of the Righteous Fire buff for spells. So we'd obviously like to benefit from these powerful buffs at all times by reaching 100% uptime on the buff and making Vengeful Cry available at will. I will address these two problems in the following sections. Getting to 100% uptime on the buff is a straightforward task. Base duration of the Vengeful Cry buff is only 3.4 seconds at level 20, but its cooldown is 8 seconds, so by default it's going to have a low uptime. However, we simply need to scale the duration of the Vengeful Cry buff, increase its cooldown recovery rate, or a combination of the two, so that the buff lasts longer than it takes for the skill to be usable again. Relevant passives are available on the bottom left of the skill tree or can be found as explicits on equipment, even available at the crafting bench. The threshold for 100% uptime is given by the following equation. By plugging in the base cooldowns and durations for the level 20 gem, we arrive at these curves. In order to have 100% uptime, the player must be operating at a combination of duration and increased cooldown recovery rate that lies above the curves shown. The green line shows the threshold for a level 20 Vengeful Cry buff by itself, and actually requires a pretty substantial investment to reach full uptime. However, if you link Vengeful Cry with a level 20 quality more duration support, as shown by the red line, the requirements become much more achievable. Moreover, quality on the Vengeful Cry gem itself grants up to 40% increased cooldown recovery rate. With just this source of duration, you'll need only 12.8% CDR to meet the threshold. But I would suggest getting more than that so that there is overlap between consecutive skill uses, allowing for a more forgiving playstyle. Fortunately, there are quite a few sources of warcry cooldown recovery rate, such as those on the bottom left of the passive tree in the As the Thunder and Natural Authority clusters. Additionally, global cooldown recovery rate will also work, so things like the Saboteur and Ascendant Ascendancy nodes, as well as Boot Implicits and Shaper Explicits, are other options for reaching the threshold. Alternatively, you could forego cooldown recovery rate entirely. By anointing the As the Thunder passive skill and using more duration support, you will reach the skill effect duration threshold where you don't need any cooldown recovery at all. This setup is quite achievable for many characters, requiring only 2 gem slots and an anoint. So now we know how to enable 100% uptime on the Vengeful Cry buff. The only remaining task is to find a way to get around the retaliation skill requirement so that we can use it at any time we want. Vengeful Cry only becomes unlocked upon taking a Savage hit, which is a hit that removes 15% of the character's maximum life calculated after mitigation. Fortunately, it doesn't specify that the hit must be from the enemy. We are therefore able to use Forbidden Rite to deal ourselves self-hit damage by carefully setting up our chaos resistance such that Forbidden Rite deals just over 15% of our maximum life and damage. We will be able to take a Savage hit whenever we want, unlocking Vengeful Cry at will. Forbidden Rite causes the character to take base chaos damage equal to 40% of their maximum life, plus 25% of their maximum energy shield. This self-damage is then reduced by the character's chaos resistance. Our resistance must be low enough to not reduce the self-hit damage below the Savage hit threshold. If we aim to guarantee proccing a Savage hit with Forbidden Rite, we can set up this inequality to calculate the threshold chaos resistance that our character can get. The left side describes the post-mitigation self-hit damage from Forbidden Rite, and this must be larger than the right side of the equation, 15% of our maximum life, which is the Savage hit threshold. We can rearrange this equation to get the expression for the maximum resistance that our character is allowed to have for this tech to work. You can simply plug in your life and energy shield numbers and solve for chaos resistance. Remember to always round your required resistance down to the nearest whole number. For life-based characters with a negligible amount of energy shield, the magic number for chaos resistance is 62%. This creates a fun optimization problem for your gear. You want to get as close to this threshold as possible so that you minimize the damage you take from enemy chaos damage as well as your own, but you must not overshoot it or you will brick the tech entirely. It makes for very fun character building. A couple of notes on this tech. The analysis given is for setups where your resistance is your only form of mitigation for chaos hit damage. Other sources of reduced damage taken, such as Fortify and Armor applies to chaos hits from the fourth vow, would increase the mitigated portion of the self-hit, resulting in a lower threshold chaos resistance. In general, I would recommend only using this tech on characters that have consistent, predictable damage mitigation for chaos. Things like, for example, the Heartstopper Ascendancy node or a variable number of Fortify stacks will make the optimization of the setup significantly harder. Also keep in mind that only hits to the life pool will count towards the Savage hit threshold. Any damage taken to Energy Shield, Ward, or Mana will not count towards proccing a Savage hit. This is important for Mind over Matter builds where you split life damage with Mana. This will result in a reduction of your maximum possible chaos resistance. Finally, this setup is obviously not possible in Chaos Inoculation builds which take no chaos damage at all. To put this tech into practice, you'll want to put Forbidden Rite and Vengeful Cry next to each other on your skill bar. You'll then cast Forbidden Rite, which will deal self-damage, and you should immediately see the Vengeful Cry icon light up and show the countdown for when it's usable. You'll then immediately follow up with your cast of Vengeful Cry. It's not required to perfectly time the cast of Vengeful Cry. You can just press the button after you've started the cast animation for Forbidden Rite, and it will be queued for use once your character is done with the animation. If you've gotten sufficient duration and cooldown reduction as discussed in the first half of the video, you should then be able to repeat this process before the buff from Vengeful Cry wears off. Continue repeating, and voila, 100% uptime on a very powerful buff at will. I've implemented this tech into a chieftain build, which is stacking warcries to get sources of life regeneration, flat damage, crit scaling, and a large more damage multiplier. A path of building link is below. The maximum rage and rage generation from this Vengeful Cry tech accounts for about 35% of my damage. It can be an extremely powerful tool if it is properly worked into a build skeleton. While it is not universally applicable for all builds, it is very powerful for attack builds, especially those at the bottom left of the tree who have easy access to the not mandatory but very helpful warcry passive wheels. For builds elsewhere that are stretched on points, the tech can be enabled with 2 gem slots. A 2020 Vengeful Cry linked to 2020 more duration support in tandem with anointing the As the Thunder for the last required bit of warcry duration. Remember to set up your chaos resistance properly as shown and always test in your hideout first. I hope that this video has given you some ideas of tech that you can work into your own builds. If you enjoyed the video or are interested in more content of this type or in-depth build guides with an emphasis on mechanics, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support.